Millions of people can watch a championship game and feel absolutely nothing, while everyone around them is screaming, celebrating, and arguing over the score. They're not necessarily boring, antisocial, or incapable of having fun. Their brains may simply attach very little emotional meaning to sports. So why does something that creates intense excitement for millions of people feel completely irrelevant to others? And what does that reveal about the way they think? Everyone around you is screaming at the screen, celebrating every goal, arguing about teams, and living and dying with every score. And you're just sitting there thinking, why does any of this matter? If that's you, you're not necessarily missing something. There may actually be a fascinating psychological reason why sports don't trigger the same excitement in you that they trigger in millions of other people. And once you understand it, you may realize that your lack of interest in sports isn't a flaw at all. It may simply reveal something about the way your mind finds excitement, meaning, and connection. One of the biggest factors is something psychologists call reward sensitivity. Essentially, how strongly a person responds to different types of stimulation and reward. For a sports fan, a close game, an unexpected comeback, intense competition, and the possibility of victory can create a powerful emotional experience. The uncertainty keeps their attention locked in. Every goal, point, or last-second decision can feel incredibly rewarding. But for someone who doesn't care about sports, those exact same things may barely register emotionally. The crowd is screaming, the score is changing, everyone is excited, and you're still wondering what you're supposed to be excited about. That doesn't necessarily mean your brain doesn't respond to rewards. It may simply respond more strongly to different ones. Your curiosity might be triggered by solving a complicated problem, understanding human behavior, creating something, learning a new idea, listening to music, exploring a subject, or having a deep conversation. In other words, the reward isn't missing. It's happening somewhere else. And that difference can completely change what feels interesting to you. Think about it this way. Two people can look at the exact same situation and experience completely different levels of excitement. One person sees a championship match and thinks, "This is incredible." Another sees the same game and thinks, "It's just people chasing a ball." Neither person is necessarily experiencing the world incorrectly. They're simply assigning different psychological value to the experience. And this becomes even more interesting when we talk about belonging. Sports aren't only about sports. For millions of people, they're also about identity. Social psychology has a concept called social identity theory, which helps explain how people develop a sense of who they are through the groups they belong to. A sports team can become one of those groups. You don't just say, "I like this team." You say, "We won." Even though you weren't on the field, you weren't coaching, you weren't making the decisions. Yet psychologically, the team's success can still feel personal because you've connected your identity to the group. That's incredibly powerful. A jersey becomes a symbol, a stadium becomes a community, a team becomes a tribe, and suddenly, watching a game isn't simply watching athletes compete, it's participating in something larger than yourself. But here's where people who don't care about sports can be completely different. They may simply not need that particular form of belonging. Their identity might come from ideas rather than teams. They may feel connected through creativity, science, philosophy, music, technology, books, art, business, or shared values. They don't need a stadium full of people to experience belonging. They might find it through one meaningful conversation, one fascinating idea, one creative project, or even through the feeling of mastering something completely on their own. So when someone asks, "How can you not support a team?" the honest answer might be, "Because I don't need one to know who I am." And that doesn't make them disconnected from society. It simply means their sense of identity comes from somewhere else. There's also another factor that can explain why sports feel almost irrelevant to some people. Childhood exposure. Think about the environment you grew up in. If your parents watched sports every weekend, talked about teams at dinner, celebrated championships, took you to games, or constantly discussed players, you were exposed to sports as more than entertainment. Sports became connected to family, tradition, excitement, connection, celebration. Maybe your first memories of a certain team involve sitting beside your father or mother. Maybe a championship reminds you of your childhood. Maybe watching the game was something your entire family did together. Over time, those emotional associations can become incredibly strong. But imagine growing up in a completely different environment. Nobody watches sports. Nobody talks about teams. Nobody cares about championships. Your family spends weekends reading, traveling, watching movies, working on projects, listening to music, or doing something completely unrelated to sports. In that environment, sports may never become emotionally meaningful. So when you become an adult and everyone around you suddenly becomes obsessed with a major tournament, you might honestly wonder what you're supposed to feel. You're not necessarily resisting something you once loved. You may simply never have developed that emotional connection in the first place. It's almost like everyone else received a cultural instruction manual that you never needed. And that's why the question isn't always, why don't you like sports? Sometimes the better question is, what did you learn to care about instead? Because human attention is limited. We don't have unlimited curiosity, emotional energy, or time. If you're deeply interested in psychology, you may spend hours analyzing human behavior. If you're fascinated by technology, you might disappear into a new subject for an entire afternoon. If you love music, you might care deeply about the smallest details of a song that another person doesn't even notice. If you're passionate about business, you might become fascinated by how companies grow and why people make certain financial decisions. Your mind is always looking for something to invest itself in, and for some people, that investment simply isn't sports. This is where another interesting pattern appears. Some people naturally prefer depth over drama. Sports are full of drama. The score changes, the crowd reacts, a player makes a mistake, someone comes back from behind. The outcome is uncertain until the very end. For millions of people, that emotional roller coaster is exactly what makes sports exciting. But not everybody enjoys emotional volatility. Some people prefer activities where the reward comes from understanding something deeply. They want complexity that unfolds slowly. They want questions with multiple layers. They want to analyze, investigate, create, solve, or understand. So while one person might spend 3 hours analyzing a team strategy, another might spend 3 hours analyzing human psychology. Both are experiencing complexity. They're just looking for it in different places. And this is why saying people who don't like sports are boring doesn't make much psychological sense. You may simply be looking for stimulation in a different form. Maybe your brain doesn't get excited by competition. Maybe it gets excited by discovery. Maybe you don't care who wins. You care about why people behave the way they do. Maybe you don't want to predict the final score. You want to understand the bigger picture. Maybe you don't enjoy watching someone else accomplish something. You'd rather build something yourself. And that brings us to another important factor, emotional investment. Sports can create incredibly intense emotional experiences. One moment you're celebrating, the next you're frustrated, then you're hopeful again, then devastated, then excited. For a passionate fan, this emotional unpredictability can be part of the entertainment. But some people naturally prefer emotional stability. They don't necessarily want their mood controlled by something happening on a screen. They might think, why would I allow the outcome of a game to determine whether I have a good evening? That doesn't mean they're emotionless. In fact, they may be deeply emotional. They simply prefer to invest those emotions in things that feel personally meaningful. Their relationships, their goals, their family, their creative work, their beliefs, their future, their personal achievements. They might prefer emotions that feel deep and lasting rather than intense and temporary. And this can also explain why some people don't understand the emotional attachment fans have to teams. Imagine someone who doesn't care about sports watching a fan become genuinely devastated because their favorite team lost. They may think, but you weren't even playing. From a purely logical perspective, that makes sense. But emotionally, the fan isn't only responding to the game. They're responding to identity, memories, belonging, anticipation, competition, and emotional investment. The team has become psychologically connected to them. And once you understand that, sports fandom becomes much easier to understand, even if you still don't care about sports yourself. But there's another fascinating possibility. Maybe you simply don't enjoy following the crowd. Personality psychology suggests that people differ in how strongly they respond to social norms and group pressure. Some people naturally look around and think, "What is everyone else doing?" Others look around and think, "Why should I do what everyone else is doing?" And that second mindset can be incredibly important because sports are one of the most socially dominant forms of entertainment in many cultures. Your coworkers talk about them, your friends talk about them, your family may talk about them. Social media is filled with them. Major sporting events become cultural events, and yet you can still look at all of it and say, "I'm just not interested." That requires a certain level of independence. You're not automatically adopting an interest simply because it's popular. You're evaluating it for yourself. Does it entertain me? Does it mean something to me? Does it make me curious? Does it add anything to my life? If the answer is no, you walk away. And that's an important psychological trait because independent thinking doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like simply refusing to pretend you care. You don't fake excitement because everyone else is excited. You don't memorize team statistics just to fit into the conversation. You don't pretend to understand the rivalry. You simply say, "It's not really my thing." And there's something surprisingly honest about that. Because imagine how much energy people spend pretending to enjoy things they don't actually enjoy simply because they want to fit in. They laugh at jokes they don't find funny. They attend events they don't want to attend. They pretend to understand conversations they're not interested in. They develop opinions because everyone else has one. And sometimes, not caring about sports is simply one example of a much broader personality trait. You don't automatically adopt other people's interests as your own. But there's an important distinction here. Not caring about sports doesn't automatically mean you're more intelligent, more creative, or more independent than people who love sports. That would simply create another stereotype. Sports fans can be incredibly intelligent, creative, analytical, and independent. The point isn't that one group is better than the other. The point is that different brains find meaning in different experiences. One person can spend hours studying football statistics and experience genuine intellectual satisfaction. Another can spend hours studying astronomy and feel exactly the same way. One person finds strategy in sports. Another finds strategy in chess. Another finds it in business. Another finds it in writing. Another finds it in understanding people. The human mind doesn't come with one universal entertainment system. And perhaps that's the most important thing to understand about people who don't care about sports. They don't necessarily lack passion. They may have an enormous amount of passion. It's simply pointed somewhere else. Maybe it's music. Maybe it's science. Maybe it's psychology. Maybe it's storytelling. Maybe it's building a business. Maybe it's creating art. Maybe it's learning. Maybe it's spending time with family. Maybe it's simply exploring ideas that nobody else around them finds interesting. So the next time everyone around you is screaming at a screen and you're sitting there wondering what the excitement is about, don't immediately assume something is wrong with you. Your brain may simply be asking a different question. Not, "Who is going to win?" but, "What else can I understand?" Not, "Which team do you support?" but, "What do you actually care about?" And once you start asking that question, you may realize something surprisingly powerful. You don't need to love what everyone else loves. You don't need to understand every obsession. You don't need to force yourself to feel excitement just because the world expects you to. Human beings are not designed to have identical interests, identical personalities, or identical sources of meaning. Sports are one way people connect with competition, identity, emotion, and community. They're not the only way, and if your passion lives somewhere else, that doesn't mean you're missing the point. It may simply mean you've found your own point. If this video helped you understand yourself or someone you know a little better, subscribe for more psychology that explains the hidden reasons behind everyday human behavior. Because sometimes the things we think make us strange are actually clues to how our minds work. And once you understand that, you can start noticing the same pattern in other parts of life. People who don't care about sports often aren't simply rejecting one particular form of entertainment. They may have developed a broader habit of deciding for themselves what deserves their attention. Their time is limited, their emotional energy is limited, and they don't automatically give either one to something simply because everyone else considers it important. That can make them surprisingly selective. They may ignore an entire conversation about a championship, but become completely absorbed when someone mentions a subject they're genuinely curious about. You might think they're uninterested in everything until you hear them talk about something they actually love. Then suddenly their personality changes. They become expressive, energetic, detailed, and intensely focused. The passion was always there. Sports simply weren't where that passion wanted to go. And this is one of the easiest things to misunderstand about quiet or indifferent people. We often judge someone's level of passion by how visibly they express it. If they're not shouting, celebrating, arguing, or getting emotionally worked up, we assume they don't care deeply about anything. But some people experience passion internally. Their excitement may look like concentration instead of screaming, curiosity instead of cheering, obsession with learning instead of obsession with a team. Imagine someone spending 6 hours researching a topic nobody else around them cares about. They might not understand why people spend 6 hours watching a game, and the sports fan might not understand why anyone would spend 6 hours reading about psychology. Both people are experiencing intense engagement. They've simply found different doors into it. And there's another subtle psychological difference: what people consider meaningful. For a sports fan, a game can represent years of history, community, tradition, competition, and personal memories. For someone who doesn't care about sports, those same things may not carry much emotional weight. They may look at the situation and think, it's entertainment. The result doesn't actually change my life. That perspective can sometimes make them less emotionally reactive to collective excitement. When everyone around them becomes intensely invested, they may remain surprisingly calm because they don't feel personally connected to the outcome. And that can be both a strength and a social challenge. The strength is independence from emotional contagion. You're less likely to have your mood completely controlled by a result that has nothing to do with your personal life. But the challenge is that you may sometimes underestimate how meaningful the experience is for someone else. If your friend has spent 10 years supporting a team, telling them that it's just a game may be logically accurate from your perspective, but psychologically incomplete. To them, it may represent family memories, friendships, identity, tradition, and belonging. Understanding that doesn't mean you have to become a fan. It simply means you can understand the person without sharing the interest. And that is actually a powerful form of emotional intelligence. You don't have to love what someone loves to understand why they love it. You can recognize the emotional meaning without personally experiencing the same emotion. That's one of the most mature ways to deal with differences in personality, because the goal isn't to convince everyone that sports are meaningless. And it isn't to convince everyone that sports are amazing. The goal is to understand why the same experience can produce completely different psychological reactions in different people. One person sees a stadium and feels excitement. Another sees noise and crowds. One person hears a commentator and feels anticipation. Another hears background noise. One person sees a championship and feels history being made. Another sees a few hours disappearing from their weekend. Neither response exists in isolation. They're connected to personality, experience, values, attention, identity, and what the individual has learned to find rewarding. And there is another possibility that deserves attention. Sometimes people don't care about sports because they don't particularly enjoy competition itself. Some people are naturally motivated by competition. They enjoy comparing performance, beating a previous record, winning against an opponent, or proving themselves under pressure. Other people are much more motivated by mastery. They don't care whether they're better than someone else. They care whether they're better than they were yesterday. That distinction can change everything. A competitive person might ask, "Who won?" A mastery-oriented person might ask, "What did I learn?" A competitive person might enjoy watching two teams fight for victory. A mastery-oriented person might prefer watching someone explain how something works. Again, neither is inherently superior. They're simply different motivational systems. And this can explain why some people find sports incredibly repetitive. They see the same basic structure over and over. Two sides compete, one wins, one loses, people celebrate, people complain, and eventually the cycle begins again. But to the fan, every game is different because the emotional context changes. The rivalry changes, the players change, the stakes change, the memories accumulate. It's similar to music. Someone who doesn't understand why another person listens to the same song 50 times may think, you've already heard it. But the listener isn't necessarily looking for new information. They're looking for a familiar emotional experience. Sports can work the same way. The fan isn't watching only to discover what happens. They're watching to experience the emotional journey. And once you understand that, the psychology becomes much more interesting. Sports are not simply entertainment. They're a psychological package containing uncertainty, competition, identity, social connection, emotional arousal, anticipation, ritual, and belonging. Some people are highly responsive to that package, others simply aren't. And if you're one of those people, you may have noticed something else. You can often walk away from sports conversations without feeling like you're missing anything. That can be a sign that your sense of social belonging isn't strongly dependent on shared mainstream interests. You don't need everyone to like the same things you like. You don't need a common team to connect. You may connect through humor, through ideas, through values, through shared experiences, through deep conversations, through creativity. And that can actually create a very different kind of social life. Instead of having dozens of casual connections based on a shared interest, you may prefer a smaller number of relationships built around personality and mutual understanding. You may not know who won the game last night, but you might remember what your friend told you about their biggest fear 3 months ago. You may forget the score, but remember a conversation that changed the way you think. You may not know the names of every famous player, but you may know exactly what makes the people you care about feel understood. That's another reminder that attention is selective. Where you spend your attention often reveals what you consider meaningful. And sometimes people discover this only after they've spent years trying to force themselves to care about things they simply don't care about. They watch games because their friends watch games. They pretend to understand the rivalry, they learn the names, they laugh at the jokes, they participate in the conversations. But internally, they're waiting for the conversation to end. Eventually, they stop pretending. And there's something freeing about that. You realize you don't have to manufacture enthusiasm. You don't have to create an emotional reaction just because everyone else is having one. You can respectfully say, "It's not for me," and move on. That doesn't make you difficult. It makes your preferences honest. Of course, there's a difference between being independent and being dismissive. You don't need to care about sports, but you also don't need to insult people who do. You can say, "I don't understand the appeal," without saying, "Anyone who likes this is stupid." Because once you start respecting the fact that different people have different reward systems and different sources of meaning, you become much less judgmental. And that principle extends far beyond sports. Some people love parties, some people hate them. Some people need constant social interaction. Some people need long periods alone. Some people love travel. Others feel most comfortable in familiar places. Some people want competition. Others want cooperation. Some people want novelty. Others want stability. Human psychology is built around variation, and sports are simply one of the clearest examples of that variation because they're so culturally visible. When almost everyone around you cares about something, the person who doesn't care becomes noticeable. That's why people who don't care about sports sometimes get asked the same questions repeatedly. How can you not like sports? You didn't watch the game? Which team do you support? Don't you feel left out? But maybe the more interesting question is, what does your brain choose instead? Because that answer can reveal far more about you than the fact that you don't watch games. Maybe you choose books. Maybe you choose documentaries. Maybe you choose building things. Maybe you choose art. Maybe you choose business. Maybe you choose science. Maybe you choose conversations. Maybe you choose experiences that are private rather than collective. And perhaps that's the real psychological lesson. Human beings don't all need the same sources of excitement. We don't all need the same sources of belonging. We don't all need the same sources of meaning. And we definitely don't need to pretend that we do. So if you've spent your entire life wondering why everyone else seems obsessed with sports while you feel absolutely nothing about them, stop assuming you're missing some essential part of being human. You may simply be discovering that your attention has its own priorities. The crowd may be watching the scoreboard. You may be watching the world, and both can be perfectly human ways of finding something worth paying attention to. And that difference becomes even more important when you look at how people decide what deserves their attention. Because attention is one of the most valuable resources the human brain has. You can always find another video to watch, another article to read, another game to follow, another conversation to join, but you cannot be deeply invested in everything. So every person, consciously or unconsciously, begins filtering the world. What is worth my time? What is worth my emotional energy? What do I genuinely want to know more about? And for some people, sports simply never make it through that filter. Not because they hate athletes, not because they think competition is bad, not because they are trying to be different. They just don't feel enough internal reward to keep paying attention. And this is where many people confuse popularity with universal meaning. Something can be incredibly popular and still mean absolutely nothing to you. Millions of people can care about it. Entire countries can stop what they're doing to watch it. Social media can be filled with reactions, and you can still feel completely detached. That doesn't mean you're cold. It means popularity doesn't automatically create personal significance. Your brain still decides what feels relevant. And sometimes, people who don't care about sports are surprisingly comfortable being outside the cultural conversation. While others may feel pressure to follow whatever everyone is discussing, they can sit quietly and think, I have nothing to add here, and that's okay. That kind of comfort can reflect a certain level of psychological independence. They don't need an opinion on everything. They don't need to pretend they watched something they didn't watch. They don't need to memorize facts just to avoid looking different. And honestly, that can be harder than it sounds. Because human beings naturally want acceptance. We want to feel included. We want to understand the conversation. We don't always enjoy being the only person in the room who doesn't get the reference. So sometimes people force themselves to care about things simply because not caring feels socially uncomfortable. But people who genuinely don't care about sports may eventually accept something important. You can belong to people without belonging to all of their interests. Your friends can love football while you don't. Your family can spend an entire evening watching a match while you read in another room. Your coworkers can debate teams during lunch while you're thinking about something completely different. Different interests don't automatically create distance. The real problem begins only when people believe that sameness is the price of connection. It isn't. Some of the strongest relationships are built between people who have completely different interests but deeply respect each other's differences. And that respect matters because psychological diversity is normal. The same brain that gets intensely excited about sports may feel bored by philosophy. The brain that loves philosophy may feel bored by sports. The person obsessed with art may not understand the excitement of coding. The person who loves coding may not understand why someone spends months creating a painting. Yet each person can experience the exact same feeling. This matters to me. And perhaps that's all passion really needs, not universal approval, just personal meaning. There's also something interesting about the way people who don't follow sports experience silence around the outcome. A major match ends. One side celebrates. The other side is disappointed. News channels discuss it. People argue online. For some, the result can influence their mood for hours or even days. But for someone who isn't emotionally invested, the next morning may feel exactly the same. They wake up, make coffee, go to work, think about their own problems, and the fact that one team defeated another may have almost no psychological impact. This emotional distance can make sports seem strange from the outside. You might wonder, how can something you have no control over affect you so much? But again, that's because you aren't emotionally connected to the symbolic meaning behind it. And this reveals something important about human emotion. We don't react strongly to events based only on what objectively happens. We react to what those events mean to us. A trophy is just an object until it represents years of effort. A song is just sound until it becomes connected to a memory. A place is just a location until someone you love lives there. And a sports team is just a group of athletes until it becomes connected to identity, family, tradition, and belonging. For the fan, the meaning is enormous. For the non-fan, the meaning may never have been created. That's why arguing about whether sports are important can sometimes miss the point entirely. Importance isn't always universal. It can be psychological, it can be personal, it can be learned. And the same is true for almost everything we love. But here's another reason some people may remain uninterested in sports. They prefer being an active participant rather than a spectator. Some individuals find it difficult to become deeply engaged by watching someone else perform when they could be doing something themselves. They might think, instead of watching someone play, I'd rather play. Or even, instead of watching someone else build a career, I'd rather work on my own. Their motivation may be directed toward participation, creation, and action. They want to experience the challenge personally. They want their own progress, their own mistakes, their own discoveries. This doesn't mean watching is inferior. It's simply a different relationship with attention. Some people love observing excellence. Others become restless unless they are creating something themselves. And if you're the second type, spending hours watching a game can feel psychologically passive. You may respect the skill. You may understand that the athletes are talented. But after a few minutes, your brain asks, okay, but what am I doing? That question can lead you somewhere completely different. Maybe you start a project. Maybe you learn a skill. Maybe you read. Maybe you exercise. Maybe you build something. Maybe you explore an idea. For you, satisfaction may come more from direct involvement than emotional investment in someone else's performance. And this can also explain why certain people don't understand the concept of celebrity obsession in general. Sports may simply be one example. They don't follow players. They don't memorize statistics. They don't care much about famous personalities. Their mind is less interested in attaching attention to people they don't personally know. Instead, they may focus on concepts, experiences, or things directly connected to their own lives. Again, this doesn't make them better. It simply reveals a different pattern of interest. And perhaps the deepest part of this psychology is the ability to separate collective excitement from personal excitement. Just because everyone is excited doesn't mean you have to be. Just because everyone is talking doesn't mean you need to talk. Just because something dominates the culture doesn't mean it deserves a permanent place in your mind. That realization can be incredibly freeing. Because once you stop feeling guilty for not caring, you create more space to discover what you actually do care about. And maybe that's the real benefit of understanding yourself. You stop asking, why am I not like everyone else? And you start asking, what actually makes me come alive? That's a much more useful question. Because perhaps the reason sports don't excite you isn't that you lack passion. Maybe you've simply been looking at the wrong place for it. Your passion might be hidden in the subject you always return to, the thing you research without being asked, the hobby that makes hours disappear, the idea you can't stop thinking about, the skill you're willing to practice even when nobody is watching, the problem you genuinely want to solve, the conversation that keeps you awake at night because your mind is still exploring it. That's where your attention naturally goes. And psychologically, that may tell you much more about who you are than whether you know the latest score, because your interests are not random pieces of your personality. They are often connected to what your brain finds rewarding, meaningful, challenging, safe, exciting, or valuable. And when you begin noticing those patterns, you can understand yourself more clearly. Maybe you don't need competition. Maybe you need curiosity. Maybe you don't need a team. Maybe you need an idea. Maybe you don't need the emotional chaos of an unpredictable game. Maybe you need something that gives you a deeper, quieter form of satisfaction. And there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. The world doesn't need everyone to watch the same thing, support the same team, or celebrate the same victory. In fact, the diversity of human interests is part of what makes people interesting. One person can spend a lifetime studying the human mind. Another can spend a lifetime mastering music. Another can become fascinated by the universe. Another can live for the thrill of competition. Another can find meaning in raising a family. Another can find it in creating something nobody has ever seen before. Different minds, different rewards, different definitions of excitement. So if you've ever sat in a room full of people celebrating a game while you felt absolutely nothing, don't immediately assume you're disconnected from the human experience. You may simply be connected to a different part of it. And maybe one day, while everyone else is asking you why you don't care about sports, you'll finally know the answer. It's not because you don't know how to feel passion. It's because your passion was never meant to live there. So if you're someone who simply doesn't care about sports, there's no reason to see that as a weakness, a personality flaw, or a sign that you're missing something everyone else understands. Your brain may simply find excitement, meaning, and connection in different places. You may not get a rush from a last-second goal, but you might get that same rush from solving a difficult problem, discovering a new idea, creating something, having a meaningful conversation, or understanding something most people overlook. And that's the real lesson here. Passion doesn't have one universal language. Some people find belonging through teams, others find it through ideas. Some people love competition, others love mastery. Some people need emotional intensity, others prefer depth and stability. Neither is automatically better. So the next time everyone around you is screaming at the screen and you're sitting there wondering, why does any of this matter? Remember that your lack of interest doesn't mean you lack passion. It may simply mean your passion lives somewhere else. You don't have to force yourself to love what the world loves. You just need to understand what genuinely makes you curious, excited, and alive. Because at the end of the day, the question isn't, why don't I care about sports? The more important question is, what do I care about and why? And sometimes, the answer to that question reveals far more about your psychology than any team you could ever support.